My name is Lynn. This is my lovely colleague Billy. We're from the University of Auckland, and so today we want to bring some of that perspective from Aotearoa New Zealand to discuss sustainable capitalism and the corporation as an entity. So I should say we've got quite a few slides in the slide pack. Some will go through a bit quickly, and it'll all be available for you if you want to do some reading afterwards. And this presentation also draws on a forthcoming article that we have in the New Zealand University's Law Review with some lovely co-authors also. And we can make that available if you'd like it as well. Okay, so in terms of the plan, I'm going to start by talking a little bit, just on the next slide, about the entity framing that we have in Aotearoa in terms of how we think about the company and its interests. And then Billy will talk about a Te Ao Maori context that we have in New Zealand, along with some examples from Maori businesses. And then I'm going to finish up at the end with some thoughts about what both of these points might mean in terms of the push towards sustainable capitalism, particularly the two key parts that we're bringing together, which is the focus on the company as an entity combined with the Te Ao Maori context. So we'll cover both and then we'll circle back at the end. Okay, so in terms of the entity framing, there's a few things that I want to touch on. The first thing is that the Companies Act 1993 is what we have in our jurisdiction, so that sits at the core of our corporate regulatory system, and it provides for the incorporation of one company type, which is a company with shares. So what's important and significant about the 1993 Act is that we don't provide for the incorporation of many different types of corporation. We have one corporate type, which is the company with shares, as I mentioned. So the idea then is that this form is simple and flexible, and that the Act itself is facilitative. So Section 15 tells us that this company that we have is an entity. It has its own legal existence. It's separate from its shareholders, and it continues until it is removed from the register. So we have one corporate type, a company with shares, and Section 15 tells us that it is a legal entity. And Susan has already spoken to us yesterday about how we had this historical development of the corporation as an entity, and that entity framing is very much the case in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Okay, so that's the company as an entity. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is we do still have like a lingering shareholder primacy norm, partly because our statutory framework, even though it's very clear that we have an entity focus, it's silent about questions of what is the entity's purpose and the entity's interest. And so obviously that silence can get filled with a shareholder primacy norm sometimes. But what's important is that because the section is silent, we have flexibility. It's really just about what the entity's interests are, what the entity's purpose is, and that's left open. And so I won't cover case law here just because it's not settled. We might have some clarity soon, actually, in a case called Mainzeal, which might come down from our Supreme Court, but currently it's unsettled, so it won't help us now. So we can just pull two parts out of the Act to talk about. The first is the long title of the Act, which talks about reaffirming the value of the company as a means of achieving economic and social benefits through the aggregation of capital, so just very open. And then in terms of the company's interests, of course, like other jurisdictions, we have directors' duties of loyalty, so they have to act in good faith and in the best interest of the company. What's particularly important for Aotearoa, I think, is that our description of the duty of loyalty ends there, so they must act in good faith in the best interest of the company, full stop. So there's no need to couch it in the, promoting the success for the benefit of the members as a whole or anything like that. I think if you think about jurisdictions, we're closer to Canada. We're quite entity focused. And so then that means that you don't have to couch the company's interest in the interest of shareholders. And we actually have a bill at the moment going through Parliament which would clarify an extra section in this duty and just make clear that a director may consider matters other than the maximization of profit when they're acting in the best interest of the company. But this is largely considered a clarification rather than a change to the law. And so the point of all of this is that we have a very much entity focused in Aotearoa, and questions around corporate purpose and interest are left open, and they're very much framed around the company as an entity. And all of this really means to say is that as a consequence, you do not need to narrow these questions to generation returns for current shareholders, and actually it opens it up to focus on growing the value of the company as an entity in and for the long term. And then this framing in terms of how we think about the company lends itself very nicely to Te Māori worldview and Māori businesses, which we think is important in the shift towards sustainable capitalism. So I'll hand over to Billy, and then I will come back to you.
Okay, thanks, Lynn. So this is where you're going to get a lot of slides. They will be made available to you. I'm going to hit the high points of each one. So the Aotearoa context, 21st century Aotearoa, we've got a lot of small to medium-sized enterprises. They're often family-owned. There's a bicultural base, and that's established by the Treaty of Waitangi, signed in 1840. One of the things that the treaty does is upholds Māori rights to be Māori, including in their economic expression. Today, I'm going to introduce three aspects of that: mana, kaitiakitanga, and whakapapa, and give you examples. Map might look upside down. This is a Māori worldview of Aotearoa, so we're doing some paradigm shifting here today. Okay, so Māori economic values, you can see here, are being theorised by a group of our colleagues as mana hou. Mana, the word for power, authority, and dignity, combined with hou, which is vitality. It's often expressed as the breath of life. Mana hou values coalesce in an economy of mana, and that was first coined by one of our late colleagues, Manuka Henare, and this idea has been advanced by further of our colleagues. It's an economic system in which decisions regarding investment, production, consumption, wealth distribution are influenced by the interplay of, and this is the important bit, mana enhancing interactions between people and environment. So what we're talking about are interactions that increase mana rather than any interactions that may lead to the need for repair or restoration. These are the four key Māori values that we included in our abstract. We're just going to focus on the bottom two today. So whakapapa. This basically underpins everything. If all that you take away from here today is an idea of whakapapa, that will be enough. It's the tissue that connects all living and non-living entities in Te Ao Māori. And it's a way of organising thoughts, processes, actions. So in a whakapapa worldview, everything is connected. What this, I think, largely means is that we can't really even begin to think about externalities if we're thinking in a whakapapa system. If we are related to the earth, if we're related to everything within it, every type of entity, we have a fundamentally different approach that is being taken there. Kaitiakitanga is more than sustainability. So I've chosen a couple of very nice definitions from a colleague, Amber Nicholson, who explains that it's this long-term intergenerational obligation to protect, maintain, enhance, again, we're getting that word enhance, the well-being of resources handed down by ancestors and that need to be handed on to future generations. Key considerations then coming out of whakapapa and kaitiakitanga and this notion of mana that must be enhanced. Economic activity that strains ecosystems is absolutely at odds with core Māori values, but activity that works with the natural environment could be compatible. And Māori culture is instrumental in Māori enterprises, and it manifests as an obligation of generosity towards kin groups. So we're seeing both that environmental sustainability and social sustainability coming through very clearly. And certainly surveys and statistics are bearing this out. So this is a survey in 2020 by BDO that found that Māori enterprises were committed to both social and cultural outcomes, that many of the smaller businesses were employing whānau, their own family members, so that they were attempting to improve the living standards among their kin networks, that 80% considered themselves to be sensitive to environmental sustainability, and they were acknowledging and contributing to a broad range of stakeholders. Temporal concerns are also important here. We're talking about ancestors, we're talking about descendants. And I'm going to share with you a case study where that sort of long-term view is actually extending out to 1,000 years. But here you just see a couple of lovely whakatauki tribal sayings that are encoding that sense of temporality, and also suggesting too, or more than suggesting, telling us that man tangata emerges last in a whakapapa system. All right, the land is older. The land will survive well beyond mankind. That's the idea that is being suggested there. So this broad view of stakeholders, this is a lovely quote from our colleague Kiri Dell and others, that Māori people whakapapa to the natural world. They take a view aligned to sustainability because of the belief that the environment is an ancestor. So what does this look like? This is actually a company established by Kiri Dell. It is absolutely founded on sustainability practices, on an understanding of living and working with a kānuka plant. You may have heard of Mānuka honey. Kānuka is a relative, formerly treated as a scrub plant, basically just cleared and burnt. What Kiri Dell has done with her whānau on that whenua, on the land they live on, is find the value in Kānuka, working with our colleagues in engineering, and they produce some really, really high value products that are doing remarkably well. They have reconceptualized this idea of natural resources as gifts. And I think this is really important and would be a nice thing for some people who've been talking about these natural resources to engage with. And really good papers written about this. Another example, just quickly, Whale Watch Kaikoura tourism company, established by a man who sought advice from his ancestors at a time when things were going very, very badly in Kaikoura. He descends from a whale riding ancestor called Paikea, made very famous by the book and movie, The Whale Rider, and they now work with the whales. And you can see here this 1,000-year view that they are taking. They've worked with these ancestors for 1,000 years already. They want to work with them for another 1,000. And finally, a report that I contributed to where we went through 7 different case studies of Māori fisheries. Māori fisheries are often awarded assets and quota as part of Waitangi Tribunal settlements. And this report talked to a lot of people working in the fisheries, managing the fisheries, about the approaches they were taking to manage the assets. And the key things here to point out are simply that they were not fishing to quota. All right, if they thought that the stocks were being depleted or things were not healthy, they would choose not to actually fish their quota. That was a lovely little line there. If Tangaroa, the sea, is your ancestor and all the species are their children, then that's the relationship you have and that's how you do it. So that's quite an extensive report and I can make that available to anybody who is interested. I'm going to hand back over to you, Lynn.
Thanks, Billy. So just to try kind of bring it all together, it's kind of a bit of a different talk and we have some references on the last slide, but what we kind of want to do is show, coming from Aotearoa, New Zealand, that when we're pushing towards sustainable capitalism, I think for our jurisdiction, what we think is important and valuable is the combination of that entity framing that's open and focused on the entity, its purpose, its interest, and the Te Ao Māori worldview. So just a couple of things. The first thing is that it's well documented in the literature, the importance of Indigenous knowledge generally in the shift towards sustainable capitalism. So what we wanted to do is just bring some examples from Aotearoa to illustrate this link and to show Māori businesses operating within our current legal framework with the corporate form. And in doing so then, using their Māori values, things like tikana, things like whakapapa, which Billy talked about, and how those values then, through that corporate form, that now allows them to run their business in a way where they have sustainable practices and priorities. And our takeaway is that we think when you couple both of these things, the inherent sustainability in a Te Ao Māori worldview, so that idea that the company's interests get balanced with past and future generations and a spiritual connection to the natural world, and then couple that with the understanding that the company in New Zealand is an entity and that it can, if it wants to exist potentially in perpetuity, So you have that long-term view as well, and that makes ESG considerations as well very material to questions around corporate purpose and corporate interest. And our take is just that those two things together, from the perspective of Aotearoa, is just a really powerful conceptualization of the company and its interests, which we just think is important in that shift towards sustainable capitalism, and has kind of manifested in the examples and case studies that Billy covered with us today. So that is it from us. Thank you.